choice.
Okay, that's right. So maybe we can also look at the other side where somebody overcomes. See, biases can be overcome as well. I mean, that's one school of thought. So can you give some example where bias was overcome during
Yes.
strategic decision making process?
Well, yes, but the problem with finding such examples is that the inner working of a person's mind is rarely revealed to others. So we have to infer from available evidence and the behaviors of individuals involved. And a good example of this, perhaps, would be the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. So, for many of your listeners and viewers, 1962 might be a little way back in time,
Right.
but it was a very dramatic instance. At the height of the Cold War, after the Second World War, your Soviet Union began to secretly ship ballistic missiles in Cuba, and they had begun to secretly install and make them operational. Their aim was to neutralize America's strategic nuclear advantage. Missiles launched from Cuba could now target all major American cities. USSR based missiles could not hit American mainland,
Okay.
whereas US missiles based on the US mainland could target every corner of USSR at that time.
Okay.
So this imbalance weighed heavily on Nikita Khrushchev's strategic mind. Now, evidence of this covert operation was soon discovered by US reconnaissance aircraft. US military advisors then told the president, John F. Kennedy, to launch an all out air, land, and sea attack on Cuba to take out all the missiles. Some of the missiles, however, were already operational and could be launched on America. Kennedy took into account the very large number of civilian and military casualties that would occur on both sides, and the very real possibility of a nuclear war between the two great powers at that time. And he went against the advice of his military. He ordered a naval quarantine of Cuba. The quarantine, a blockade really, would now prevent any further arms shipments into Cuba and effectively demonstrate the muscular and determined US response. With the quarantine in place, he then asked USSR to unconditionally withdraw all nuclear missiles from Cuba. A process of negotiation followed, but Khrushchev, then the Soviet premier, backed down and agreed to dismantle all missiles and ship them back to the Soviet Union. A nuclear catastrophe was hanging by a thread. It was averted.
So in this case,
So here,
yeah.
it was all too easy for John F. Kennedy to be taken in by the advice of his experts, the military experts, right? And they were hawks. US military had also suffered an indirect setback some time ago in a previous year when their Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba was pushed back. Right? And I'll come to that in a moment. But John F. Kennedy, so what is not clear to us is how John F. Kennedy's mind worked during that time.
Right.
But it is clear that he contemplated. It is clear that he heard all sides and all points of view. It is also clear that he took several actions to mitigate the risk of a nuclear war. For example, he sent his brother, Robert Kennedy, to negotiate, to sort of negotiate, not overtly negotiate, with the Soviet ambassador in the United States, Alexander Dobrynin. In other words, he was opening a side avenue for diplomatic exchanges. So Kennedy, in my opinion, was able to overcome the bias that he may have been susceptible to. But the same example, incidentally, Vinay, is a wonderful story of how Khrushchev, on the other hand, was susceptible to the opposite kind of bias.
I see.
So in 1961, the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was launched at the behest of the CIA. In fact, CIA had armed, financed, and trained Cuban exiles in Florida in US and made them ready. And they landed at the shores of Cuba to create an insurrection and coup. But the Cuban military defeated that. Khrushchev saw in this a weakness of President Kennedy. President Kennedy was a first-time president of the United States. And he felt that he was a weak decision maker. He was a weak president. And that even if the missiles in Cuba were discovered, the response of the United States will not be robust. But as you know, America did not take this as a fait accompli. And ultimately, the Soviet debacle from the missile crisis cost Khrushchev his premiership. 2 years later, he was removed by the USSR Presidium. And he spent the rest of the years of his life in a fairly ignominy, or you can call it, or certainly far, far away from public notice.
I see.
Till he died
Yeah.
in 1971 at the age of 77.
So I agree with you. So you're saying these are examples where you can really see cognitive biases can play a big role.
Yes.
Not just on one decision, but for many years, its impact could last.
Indeed.
And of course, it would also affect the person's career, perhaps forever.
Yes, yes. But you can just imagine,
right.
The Cuban Missile Crisis could have ended very differently.
That's very true.
And there would have been a nuclear holocaust all over the world.
I mean, it can be really devastating thing.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, just to stress the point, America at that time had 5,000 nuclear warheads.
Ooh. Yeah.
So you can imagine.
I can.
Even a few hundred fired would have caused
That's